Hello, in this workshop, we are going to create a widget for Permapages. A widget is basically a way to build a plugin for Permapages so that users can add those plugins or widgets to their Web3 profile pages. Permapages is a Web3 application that enables non-developer users to create and publish web pages. These web pages are permanently available on Arweave and can be registered with the RNS registry. A widget is a collection of code that interacts with HTML and the browser to create rich and collaborative functionality for visitors of the page. What you need to know in this workshop is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, having a GitHub account and Git installed on your local machine, familiarity with Node.js and NPM systems, and you'll need to have basic knowledge of the Arweave development ecosystem, primarily the Arweave SDK and Warp, although we won't use Warp in this workshop. What tools do you need? You need a code editor. Visual Studio Code is what we'll be using. You also need a GitHub account. And you'll need to have Node.js and plus NPM installed on your system. So the widget we're going to build in this workshop is a Permapage history widget. So there'll be a button that the user clicks it, and then it'll display a modal dialog showing the history of all the revisions of that particular page. Um, the agenda, the setup should take about 10 minutes. The uh, query page history about 5 minutes, the widget about 10 minutes, and the test widget about 5. And then um, publishing the widget should only take around 5 minutes. So we'll walk through this today, and by the end of this, you'll have a Permapage widget that you can, you know, include in your Permapage or make it available for others to include. Although this is just a demo, but feel free to use this and expand and create other widgets like this. So the first thing we need to do is open a terminal and start off with a widget template. Now it's important to note that with these widgets, they can be built in vanilla JS or using your favorite framework. Recommend to use frameworks that create a very small footprint, like Svelte or Solid or Preact, versus larger frameworks because you have to ship the entire JavaScript in your app. Now, you can, in your widget, you can use ESM imports because the widgets are imported as modules. So you could possibly pull in dependencies that way. But I think ideally, keep your widget dependency free and as small as possible. So with that said, we're going to use this felt template that we've created here, and that'll just give us a starting point for building our widget. So we're going to go to our terminal, and we're going to do, let's see if I can position this better. So we're going to check our directory. We're in our projects directory. So we're going to do npx d git twilson63 / widget template. And then we're going to give it a project name. So we're going to say page history and execute that. And then we're going to cd into that project page, and we're going to do npm install to install all of the dependencies. And we're going to also add date functions because we're doing a page history revision list. We're going to want to format the timestamp to show a user readable date. So we're going to npm install date functions. Cool. So now that we've got those dependencies, we're going to set up some utilities to help us. So we're going to make a directory in our lib folder, our source folder called lib, and then we're going to create a file lib utils.js, and we'll copy this code in that file. So, and I'm going to go ahead and open up my code editor at this point. So I'm just doing code dot. And let's see here. Okay. So we should have our utils file, and I'm going to change this prompt, be a little less noisy. And then what we want to do is copy our code. So we're going to grab our code right here. And this is just a utility that I found from MDN that will basically allow us to generate a unique string of characters. And I'll explain why we'll need that in the future, but that's just a utility that we'll be using. The second kind of setup is a modal component, and this component will just allow us to, not have to include all the modal boilerplate to pop up in our widget. We can just use this. So with that, we're going to make a directory called components, and then we're going to create a file called modal.spelt. So in our terminal in Visual Studio, we're going to make a directory called components under the source folder, and then we're going to create a file called modal.svlte, spelt. Great. Now we'll open that modal component up, and we'll just copy this component here. And again, this is just a standard modal component that we can pass in, and you can see where it's using this R&D utility function, so that every time this dialog is created, it can have an ID, a unique ID, and we can guarantee that that ID is unique. So those are kind of all of the setup pieces. So the next file we're going to work on is the page history. The page history will actually be our data access layer, and it will actually work with Arweave and get all of the data. So to do that, we're going to create the file. So we can do touch source lib history.js, and then we'll just open that file, history.js. Okay, so in this file, we want to import our date formats function. So I'm going to see if I can't just pop this to the right and pop that to the left and pop this to the right, and we can kind of work through this together. So we can import format from the date functions format, And then in a widget, we have some things on the perma page that are already in our environment. One of them is arweave. So we can just init arweave by doing const arweave equals window dot arweave dot init, and then we'll give it a host net and protocol yes and port 443. Okay, and we can, if we want to use warp, we can bring that in as well because that's added. We won't use it in this particular demo, but in the future we'll record workshops with it. So basically, to connect to warp, you just bring it in from window and then the warp web factory and then mem cached and then the arweave dependency, and that will create warp so that you can work with smart contracts. So we're going to have one main function in history. It's going to be export async function page history, and it's going to take a transaction ID. So we'll have the transaction ID, and what we're going to want to do in the future, we'd be able to call this contract, but currently we can't do that. So we have to change this a little bit. What we want to do is essentially get the owner and title, and we're going to get that from a function called get tx info, pass in the tx ID, and we'll define that in a minute. And then once we have the owner and title, we can essentially query the history of this page because we know the page's transaction ID and we know who owns it, and we know, and the owner is the wallet address, who owns it, and then the title. So we can ask Arweave via GraphQL, give us all the transactions that meet that criteria. So we're going to say await arweave.api.post, and we want to post to the GraphQL endpoint, and we want to pass in a body of query, and then we're going to create a function to build our query text. So we'll say history query, and then we'll pass in owner and title. And then we're going to return, but before we return, we want to format the data a bit. So we're going to call this function format data result.data. And that'll basically, GraphQL will send this in a particular format, and we're going to parse that format to return it into a format that's easier for our widget to recognize. So we've got a couple of methods here to implement. One is to get the transaction info, and then the other is this history query method. Let's go ahead and do the get transaction info first. Well, we have three, and then the format data method. But let's go ahead and do the get transaction info function first. So we'll say function get tx info, and it's going to take a tx ID as an argument. And then what we want to do is essentially build a query. So we'll say const result equals await. We'll probably need to make this function async. And then with our await, we're going to call arweave.api.post GraphQL. And then that body will have a query. And in that query, we're going to add our query. So I've queued up the queries here so it'll be a little bit easier to see. Hopefully on this screen, I'll make this full screen. The first query will take a transaction ID and we're going to call the transaction query select name, our query, and then we're going to pass it in the ID of our Permapage because this widget lives on the Permapage, so it'll get handed that ID. And then we're going to find the address of the owner and we're going to get all the tags. And particularly, we're looking for this page title tag. So if we run this, this is what we get on the right: data, transaction, owner.address, and data dot transaction dot tags is an array that will find the page title. So let's go ahead and copy this query, bounce that over to the left, and we can paste that in here. But instead of the hard-coded transaction, we're going to use a template parameter of txid. Okay. So that's our query. And that's going to return a data result. And then what we want to do is return an object that has the owner, which will be data.transaction dot owner dot address. Okay. And then we want the title, which will be data transaction dot find, and then find takes a predicate function. So we're going to have a tag, and then we want to find the one where tag.name equals page dash title, right? And then we'll grab the value property off of that. So that would be our title, and that should be that function, which gives us the owner and title, and then we can make another query. Cool. So the next function we need to create is, we'll go ahead and create this format data function. So format data is going to take an object that has a data attribute in it that will destructure. Then we're going to return data.transactions.edges.map. So when it returns results, it returns data.transactions.edges, and then edges is an array of all the nodes. So we're going to map that, and in that function, the mapper function, we're going to destructure the node property, and we're going to create a helper function called get tag that'll take the name, and this function will just return node.tags.find tag, and we want tag.name to equal tag name. Then we'll add a question mark dot value because it could return null. And we should probably do the same thing down here. Basically, we want the result to be null if it's not found. And cool, that's our little helper function. And then what we need to do is return an object. And this object is going to have three properties: web page, where we'll get tag, oops, get tag web page, and status. And status is a message when you publish a permapage that the user can leave, like first commit, or added more info in bio, etc. So you can do get tag and status, and then finally the timestamp. So we'll get the timestamp, and we'll call format from our date functions, and we'll convert the timestamp to a new date and get the tag timestamp. And for this format, we're going to use m/dd/yyh:_MMA. And that should give us the date, the month, the day, the year, the hour, the minutes, and AM or PM for the particular time zone. Cool. So that's our format data. And so it's going to map or loop through each result for revision and just format it into this object for us here. And then the last function we need to implement is the history query. So we'll say function history query, and it's going to take owner and title. And basically, if we look at our playground, our second tab, basically we're going to call the transactions query, ask for the first 100, passing in the owner, and passing in these tags. We want to make sure the content type is application JSON, the app name is Permapages, and the page title is Rackus. So the Rackus would be the parameter and the owner would be the parameter. So let's go ahead and do that. And for this, we can just go ahead and copy and paste this query. It's pretty straightforward. Okay. So now we've got the history library set up. We've got our modal, we've got our utils, and now we can start to work on the widget component. And the structure of this project is basically pretty standard. We've got a source folder, and in that source folder, we've got our components in lib, and then we've got a main.js file that basically instantiates our widget. And then we've got a widget.svelte file. This is our widget component, and it's got some basic boilerplate in there right now from the template. And what we're going to want to do is change that to be our page component. Now, also we have a example folder. This example folder has an index.html file that we can use to test our component, our widget. So we'll be looking at that later. And then we have this deploy.mjs file, and we'll be using that to actually deploy this widget to the permaweb so that it can be visible for Permapages to include in its little registry. So with that, we'll go ahead and just delete everything from the template widget, and we'll start with our page history widget. So we'll start with a script tag, and in that script tag, we want to import the modal component, and we want to import our page history library. that. And we're going to default the dialog to history dialog equals false. And we're going to create an async function that handles the click event. And we'll just say history dialog equals true. Cool. Now we're going to make a button as kind of the default view of our widget. It's going to be class button, button primary, width full. And you can change these however you like. And then we'll have an on-click handler. We'll just handle the click event. We'll just say show page history. Okay. So that's our button. And now we'll define our modal. So we'll use the modal component, and we'll use the open attribute to tell the modal if it should be visible or not. So if history dialog is true, the modal will be visible. And you see in the handle click, we're setting it to true. If it's false, it will be invisible. And then we'll handle the on click event. And basically we just need to set the history dialog variable to false. Okay. All right. So now the rest is just what we want our modal to look like and what we want it to display. Um, okay, I think we're good there. Look a little weird. Um, yeah. Okay. So first thing we want is in header 2. And because we're using Tailwind, we have to specify the sizes by default. There's a pros tool we can use with typography, but you get better control by just specifying what you want your particular elements to look like. So we're going to do text extra large, and we're going to do margin bottom 8 to provide a little bit of margin between the heading and the list of pages. And we'll just add our title, Permapage history. Okay. And the next thing we want to do is use our await directive. And this await directive will allow us to execute this page history function, which is a promise. So it's going to await that. And then we can add some text, or you could add a spinner or whatever. And then we're going to do the then portion of the directive and put all the results in this history variable. And we could also handle errors, but we won't in this workshop. But, well, we can. It'd be good. So we can do catch error, and then we could just say error.message. Okay. So with the history, I'm going to use a table, and I'm going to just copy most of this. So basically, we're just going to have a table with the date, status, and link. And then we're going to do an each directive where we go through the history results, and each item on there is a page object. We'll end that. And then we'll just define our record, which will look like that. And what we have is the timestamp, the status, and then a link button that we could click on to see each revision. Then we'll close our body and table after our each. And then we close our await and our modal. So let's open that up. And we have our table, body, spring. These tabs are getting out of control. Okay. All that looks pretty good. We'll save that. And that should be our widget. Now, one of the things we're going to want to do is use a unique name for our widget. So we're going to use the element ID page history. Now, you can put custom data elements as you define your widget, and that comes into this data set um, property off of the element. But since we are not going to use any, we're going to just comment that out because we're not going to use any custom elements or data attributes on your element, and we don't need to send any props. That now there's one thing I think I need to go back to the widget. So when we call this page history, we need to pass in TX ID, right? And we need to grab that TX ID from the environment of the page, and that's going to be set on the window object. So we can say let txid equal window dot transaction ID. Okay, like that. Um, and yeah, so we have that, and yeah, that should all be good. And then in our example, we'll set the window.transaction ID to test it. Also, we're going to call our element page history, and that'll represent where we want to show it in the page. And now let's go ahead and build our component. Cool. So we built it, and now we're ready to test. I think, yes, we're ready to test our widget. And we've set up this example, so let's go ahead and review this example HTML code. Okay, here's our example page, and it brings in Tailwind and Daisy UI, so we can use that for our structures. It also brings in Arweave, and it's going to grab our widget.js file of type module, and then we defer that. And then here on our div, we're not using any data attributes. And then our widget name, we're going to make sure that matches what we specified in main. So it needs to match this page history attribute. So page history. Now, the other thing we need to do is set our transaction ID. So we'll say window dot transaction ID equal, and we're just going to use this transaction that we've been using in our um, GraphQL queries. This transaction has pages that we can look at. Basically, it's this Permapage here. Okay. Um, so we'll just set that there. And I think now we're ready to do our example. And I'm using yarn, but you can also do npm run build and npm run example. And that should open our example HTML file on port 3000. And it's going to copy this widget.js file from our dist folder into this folder. So we should be able to go to our browser and open up localhost 3000. And let's see. Oh, no, I'm running something else in the background. Hang on. Running my Permapages in the background. Let's close that. Let's restart this. There we go. So our example page is showing. It's showing page history button right here. And if we click it, get our modal, and oh, we've got an error. So let's go ahead and fix that. So data.data transaction.find is not a function, so it needs to be tags right there. So let's go into our history, and where we're building that is right here. Dot tags. So data.data transaction.tags.find, and then value. All right. So right now, this is, very new. So don't have a lot of automation in the terms of the development environment. Plan to add that in the very near future. So when you make a change, the watch will regenerate the widget and redrop it in the example directory. So right now, you just have to do npm run build to build it again, and npm run example here. Okay, so now we can refresh our page. And now if we show page history, tag name is not defined. Cool, doing some good debugging here. Tag name is not defined. So that's this guy. And this helper function. Oh, I called it name. So let's say tag name. That should be a little bit better. Let's respin it. Refresh. Oh, there we go. There's our page history. So we can look at all of the wonderful iterations of this version. Here's like the first version. And then we can go see our weave mel test. Got weave mel in there. And we can go to our current version here. Cool. So with this widget, basically when users pick this widget to put on their page, it's going to show a button full length. So ideally, this would probably be good to do at the bottom of the page. And how you would do that is in your HTML or in your content editor, this ID will appear and you would just, put all the other stuff in front of it and put that at the bottom. And then that would put the bottom, the page history at the bottom of your Permapage. But in order to put it into a Permapage for a user, we need to publish it. And that's kind of the final step of our tutorial. It's how to publish this, and we'll kind of walk through the code because it's already written for us in our template, and that is in the deploy MJS file. So basically we're using the bundler network client to deploy because it's free. We do need a wallet, but other than that, it's free. And I'm going to copy a wallet. Let's see. And I'm going to rename it to wallet.json like that. Okay. So we're grabbing the wallet file that we include in our process argument, and then we're using bundlers node 2 and rweave, and then we read our widget file, and then we add these tags to it. So one of the things we want to change is our widget name to page history and add a description. Permapage widget to show page history. And then if we had documentation, we would want to add it here. Great use case for permanotes is you can quickly add your documentation and just link it and know that it will always be there with no cost. And then we're going to create our transaction, sign it, and upload it. And then we'll just log out deployed and our transaction ID. These tags will allow for Permapages to discover this widget and offer it to users to put into their page. So with that, we've got that, and we should be able to say npm run deploy and pass in wallet JSON like that. And we deployed it. There's our transaction ID, and we should be able to recognize it on rweave.net in a few moments. So that concludes this tutorial. Please, if you have any questions or comments, to post them. This is very much a work in progress, so if you run into any issues, please let me know in the comment section, or you can go to the r.io Discord page, and there's a channel called Permapages-help, and be happy to take any questions there as well. Thanks.